Hi, thanks for joining us, and we're going to be talking about the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, where we're meeting first responders where they are. And we're going to be doing a series of webinars that addresses acute trauma, cumulative trauma, and specifically suicide, as we've seen an uptick in the various suicides within the law enforcement community. My name is Chris Scallon. I am a just recently retired sergeant that founded the Critical Incident Stress Management Peer Support Unit for the Norfolk Police Department in Norfolk, Virginia, and currently work with the IACP as a fellow for the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit project.
And I'm Lisa Teason. I'm a social worker. I have been working in healthcare for many years, both in areas of sexual, domestic, and community violence and vicarious trauma. And I've joined Chris in working on the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit that we will be introducing you to. We'll start off with introducing the toolkit and then moving into how to use the toolkit in each of the three areas that Chris mentioned: acute trauma, cumulative trauma, and suicide.
Our public safety first responders are certainly seeing more than they've ever seen in the past, and it's affecting us.
You see people injured from accidents, you see people injured from fights and gunshots and violence.
It is hard for someone to not take it home. The firefighter, the EMS provider is always going to have that residual, and the police officer as well.
I've seen suicide with my colleagues. I have seen excessive drinking. I've seen drug use. I've seen bullyish behavior.
There is a need to focus on the physical and mental well-being of the providers. Not just their knowledge and skills to do the job, but their ability to process and handle it.
As management, we have to take care of our employees who we know we're putting in situations which could adversely affect the quality of their work and the quality of their life.
We want it to be okay in the fire service for someone to say, this is bothering me, need to talk about it. And having that coping mechanism for them to try and de-escalate the anxiety that they might be experiencing.
It's not that you're not macho if you ask for help. In fact, it's actually a good thing when you recognize it both in yourself and in others.
The Vicarious Trauma Toolkit provides a platform from which any agency can begin the steps to becoming more trauma informed.
We're offering help and services before something has a tendency to get worse. And we're putting things in place, aiding and assisting so that things can get back to working smoothly.
If they're at a serious scene, I'll wait on the side and just let them know that I'm available. Instead of waiting till it blows beyond control, they can deal with the trauma or deal with whatever's necessary at the time.
And I think that if an agency is trauma informed, you have a better workforce, you have a happier workforce, you have a more productive workforce.
Your agency needs resources to be able to understand and address the direct and vicarious trauma which your employees, by the very nature of what they do for a living, are going to be exposed to.
Our hope is that this toolkit will give them everything they need. Teaching people to cope, teaching people to mentor others on how to cope, and giving resources to really take care of our own.
As we heard from the responders in the video, and we hear from Dr. Rachel Remen, working with trauma survivors, attending to traumatic events affects us. It affects us in how we live, how we work, and not recognizing its impact is as unrealistic as expecting us to be able to walk through water without getting wet. We get wet every day. And the toolkit was developed as a response to that experience of being exposed to traumatic events day in and day out. Specifically, it's a resource for law enforcement, emergency medical services, fire services, and victim services to help your agencies become vicarious trauma informed. In 2013, the Office for Victims of Crime granted Northeastern University granted them the award to create this free online compendium of resources for people in these fields. And it was built for the field and by the field. Chris and I represent two of the key agencies involved, the International Association of Chiefs of Police and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. We joined these other key national and local organizations to create this toolkit as a resource for you. The resource the toolkit was started in 2013 when we were awarded this grant. We collected resources and vetted them by doing a survey of providers in all 4 professions across the country, as well as gathering resources on our own and vetting them. We reviewed over hundreds of resources, and we came down to 500 of state-of-the-field, evidence-informed resources. Our goal was to help organizations become vicarious trauma informed by recognizing upfront the potential negative consequences of your work and proactively addressing those impacts. As we reviewed the literature, as we reviewed resources and looked at experience across the country, we learned that these 5 pillars really represent what it takes to be a healthy, both trauma and vicarious trauma-informed organization. And as we discuss cumulative trauma, we will begin with trauma and then talk about the resources in each of these 5 areas.
So what exactly is trauma? We've come to understand, and this again has been taken from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as it relates to cumulative traumas. And it's the direct experiencing or witnessing of an actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence. But it's also important to note that while there's direct exposure to trauma, there's also indirect exposure that can lead to, for example, listed here, post-traumatic stress disorder diagnoses. So it's not so much that we need to be in danger, but we can also be standing or be communicating or interacting with somebody who's been directly exposed, and then vicariously we start succumbing to the trauma through what somebody else has been exposed to. So again, direct exposure or threatened exposure or indirect exposure. It's also important to understand what happens to us physiologically. When we have a physiological response, or what we call the stress response, it's our body telling us, okay, we're getting ready to do something, or we're in the middle of something. But it's important to understand that these responses, or these physiological responses, don't necessarily subside right away. And you can start seeing these types of responses years and years later. But it's important as we work in the field of first responders that we identify what somebody's going through. So understanding that somebody may be having a stress response, that we can address it by outlining what the physical attributes are. So in first responders, there's a 98% have at least experienced one type of critical incident, and made comment to this earlier. I'm not quite sure where the other 2 were during their career, but I would venture to say that more towards 100% of officers that have worked for more than a couple of days have been exposed to at least one critical incident. But there's also exposure to multiple traumatic events, both the indirect and direct, that has a cumulative impact and on how severe our responses can be. So it's really important to see this as a spectrum, or on a spectrum, where the severity and the exposure vary, and we don't have one tool to address one incident or one for the whole spectrum. So it's important to use the right tool with the right response. What's interesting to see, excuse me, here in the description of critical incidents, and when polled urban police officers, the more common exposures are listed on the left, seeing somebody dead, a badly beaten adult, all the way down to seeing someone die. Those are the common exposures. But when we asked the officers, or when the officers were asked to rank by severity, you start seeing that mistakes that injures or kills, or colleague intentionally killed, colleague killed accidentally, or being taken hostage, you start seeing that we're in a controlling, or we're in a a field of work that puts us in a place of authority. And when we don't have control over these incidents, again, the mistakes or the intentional killing of a colleague, it really wears on us, and we find more stress in these incidents than what our common exposures are. So as we break down the three, the acute, cumulative, and suicide, we're going to start focusing on what acute trauma is and how it plays within the 5 pillars that we've identified through the research. So it's important when addressing acute trauma, there's no need to, again, like I said before, to reinvent the wheel. So what do we do? How do we effectively lead and guide our mission as executive staff in any organization? So the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit includes a tool which we've called the Vicarious Trauma Organizational Readiness Guide. And what that does is it identifies gaps of service, and it's utilized in a 360-degree evaluation. In other words, we're not just talking to the upper echelon of an agency, we're also talking to the boots on the ground, to the civilians that work there, and all the first responders in between. The importance of that is that we want somebody at the upper level may think that something's working, but when you get down to the ground level, they're like, well, no, it's not working. So this is a true, honest look of where your agency stands. And once you identify the gaps, you can start addressing them. So, for example, certain agencies may have nothing in place for reintegration of veterans. That's when you would start saying, hey, we have a lot of folks that are active military who are also police, fire, rescue, and victim services. What kind of programs can we do or use? And again, the toolkit will all contains within the toolkit. And if there's a question, it's also important to contact and reach out to the individual that provided, whether it be a policy, a procedure, a protocol.
What Chris and I were also talking about is how important it is for leadership to lead out in this area as an organization begins to address these issues of vicarious trauma, acute trauma. Nothing's going to happen if leadership doesn't buy in. And one of the other tools we've created is a series of talking points that could be used by leadership to communicate both across to other departments, but also within their own department about the critical importance of addressing, responding to trauma, vicarious trauma for the staff. It's really making sure that the leadership is taking the time to pay attention to what's going on with staff so that they can be prepared to address it.
So it's not necessarily rocket science, and for often we see people not preparing for what they expect. So as a leader in any organization, we need to anticipate some of the inevitable traumas, specifically acute traumas. For example, in a law enforcement agency, unfortunately, our line of work comes with line of duty deaths, line of duty injuries, officer-involved shootings. These are the big ones. Suicide, which we'll address in a later webinar, are significant. There's a ripple effects. There's no need to wait for these things to happen before we create a plan. So as leaders, and to create a mission so that we have, in a sense, guidance on where an agency is going, you need to create, support, and sustain. And support and sustaining these programs are pivotal in ensuring the mental health of our people. Some of the programs that can help are the critical incident stress management, peer support programs, and also establishing appropriate protocols, policies, and resources that are regionally specific and catered to your agency. But most importantly, a lot of people like to just throw a lot of tools, and they don't reevaluate to see if they're working. So the best part about this is that you need to follow up and ensure that the tools that you're using are working. And the beauty is, if they're not working, then you start over again, and you're trying to find tools that will help guide your agency in the right way. And they're all available, or the majority are going to be available on the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit.
And it may be that you've done the VT.org, the Organizational Readiness Guide assessment, and you find you want to redo it a year from now to make sure you're on target with what areas you're trying to strengthen across the organization.
So it's important that we touch on all these various pillars that we've been discussing. And I find that a portion of any agency that carries a heavy load is going to be that frontline supervision or the immediate supervision to some of the troops. They're the ones that are going to be ensuring that the implementation of the protocols and policies and resources are actually working. Or if there's something wrong, they're in a position to bring it up to the executive level. But at that level, at a mid-manager or frontline supervisor, that's where you're going to be fostering that environment of healthy communication. It should be okay as a supervisor for the subordinates to come to you and be honest about, what's bothering them, what they need, what kind of help they need, and also as management or frontline supervision, you have just as much access to the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit and would encourage you to use that as another tool in your toolbox.
And the victim advocates may have more ongoing one-to-one or group supervision more than other staff within your organization. It's important, however you are coming together, whether it's a team meeting, whether it's roll call, whether it's individual or group supervision, that doing that, providing that opportunity to talk, to reevaluate regularly, it really fosters that environment of healthy communication and open communication so that staff do feel comfortable coming to you as a supervisor or a manager to talk about some of the impacts of these acute episodes.
One of the greatest aspects of the toolkit, or what it points out and how this works, is that we're not here to give you a bunch of tools to fix people, although in the end they'll be more they'll be better off for some of the information, some of the tools that we're given. But as first responders or even public safety, we don't want to be fixed. We are specific type personalities that want to be in control. Obviously, when somebody's in crisis, they get to the point where they're going to need a little help, and that's fine. So we want to include the employee or the individual in crisis in how they help navigate their own crisis. So they become part of the solution, which is empowering. And once you start getting those empowering movements and the employee sees that they're part of it, it's contagious and it's infectious. And you'll start seeing that employee help other employees. And the work environment, especially in the wake of an acute trauma, is very volatile. And it's important that it's addressed and that everybody is given the same amount of weight as to how they can help themselves or help others.
And if it's a large event or if it's one of the smaller events that we've mentioned, being able to call a meeting or call a gathering to talk about what's happened in your community or across the globe really inspires people and also empowers them to knowing that they can speak, they will be heard, they can gather the troops, as Chris has said. That really helps with morale as well. We know that training and professional development ongoing is critical. We want to make sure that people across your agency are trained, know about trauma, know about both acute and cumulative trauma, vicarious trauma, and you may want to think about incorporating trauma-informed policing in your promotional process, in your annual recertification, certainly in your annual reviews. You want to be thinking about both the training that's been received, but how is it being incorporated? You want to think if you incorporate trauma survivors who've successfully survived situations themselves, that they are ready to be involved. They can be enormously helpful. Maybe you use someone in the ranks who speaks at a forum, on a panel, at some type of an event, but you want to really pay attention to both how they're doing before, in terms of preparing them, during, and after that event in which they speak. We don't want to do further harm. I have to say also, though, that having survivors participate can really be a part of their healing, but it has to be done thoughtfully and with real intentionality. Chris, do you want to add to that at all?
So with regards to training, and again, these 5 pillars tend to bleed into each other. One affects the other. In other words, if you don't have a mission or direction, you're not going to have good management because they're not going to know what to employ. And the same thing goes for training. And what we see is we know we're going to come across those line of duty deaths, line of duty injuries, all these different things that we're going to inevitably see. We can capitalize on the folks that have been through this successfully, like Lisa was talking about, but it becomes a cyclical helping yourself and then becoming more knowledged or becoming more aware through training and professionally developing and becoming a champion of mental health or being trauma informed. And as a result, as you help yourself and begin to help others, you start, like Lisa was saying, and again, addressing yourself and becoming better for it. This doesn't happen unless the environment of communication is available, and it's a healthy one. But more importantly, a lot of agencies like to go within themselves and don't like to reach out for specific type help. Becoming informed, specifically in the wake of an acute trauma, you can start identifying specific individuals within the agency that can start becoming these champions and start helping themselves and then train. And then before you know it, you'll have a cadre of people that are there at a moment's notice once your agency has or experiences an acute trauma.
I'd just add, too, that as we saw while working on the toolkit and as we've seen in crises in our own communities, the kind of ongoing connection and collaboration really enables us in a cross-disciplinary way to get to know each other, to trust each other, and really to have each other's backs. So we wrap up with the staff health and wellness, which at times is the final area that's attended to. And we can't emphasize enough how important it is to be employing emerging practices that are really both really available, can be available on-site and off-site. What we are seeing across, and I'll let Chris speak even more, we're seeing both mindfulness-based stress reduction and other forms of mindfulness and relaxation being employed with sworn officers as well as advocates and other staff, really in a great way. We're seeing people make use of not only fitness rooms, but wellness rooms for quiet time during the day, if you can even carve out 5 minutes. We're seeing better use of the array of healthcare services that are available, time off. Even making use of your lunch and your break time can be really aspects of wellness on the job.
Yeah, I agree. In all aspects of the 5 pillars that we discussed, the most important, most significant that I would take away from staff health and wellness is that if you're in a position to start helping people and that's what you do for your agencies, staff health and wellness doesn't mean helping everybody else. It also means self-care, and it's very important. And I equate it to the old concept of when you're flying in a plane, the attendant will tell you, if the mask come down, put the mask on yourself first and then put it on the people that you're with. And there's no different here. Make sure that you're in a healthy place while you're helping other people out. And unfortunately, the toughest decisions we make is to know when we shouldn't be doing it. Because in most people that work in this field, their ability to help is not necessarily the same as their desire. And the desire to help may sometimes outweigh the ability, and you'll start seeing adverse effects of over-involvement.
As we get ready to wrap up in this area, I'm reminded that Chris and I were talking quite a bit about sleep in the wake of acute traumatic events and how our sleep can get disrupted, and yet how that is a core element of anyone's wellness program. We need to do our best, I think, both of certainly getting fluids in, making sure we're drinking water and releasing the toxins that get generated when we are under extreme duress. I think about getting even a bit of exercise. Often when there's a larger event, we're moving around, we're going to place, but we may be doing that in our even everyday traumatic events. But Chris was reminding me also of this new resource that's available of the float.
Sure. Some of the biggest complaints, or the majority of the complaints that I hear whenever we're dealing with individuals that have experienced acute trauma, is that it really disrupts their sleep. And that's not to say that their sleep was the greatest prior to that. So one of the resources that we were able to do, working through the toolkit and the connections being made, was float therapy, and where an hour of sleep in a float tank is equivalent to 8 hours of REM sleep. It's been so effective that our military has actually purchased them for pre and post deployments for some of the service members deploying overseas. It works, and it is available all over the country. But again, going through the toolkit and reaching out to various organizations that already utilize this, it's just one single tool and a sea of tools that if you don't know it's there, can't help you.
And I guess as a way to loop back around, since not everyone will have a float tank available, I'd like to try it myself, is it gets back to leadership. Leadership paying attention to what staff are going through when there's an acute event, so that they can say, okay, Chris, okay, Lisa, take the next day off. Have that, set in stone within your organizations. And I think law enforcement does a better job at that after some larger events, but also maybe some of the cumulative events that we'll be talking about next. Paying attention who needs some time off and flexing that time so that people can get some relaxation and actually might get some sleep could really be one of the best interventions you give. So we were so happy to have you join us today. We want to let you know that as our project wraps up September 30th, 2018, that OVC TTAC, the Training and Technical Assistance Center for the Office of Victims of Crime, has taken over the training and technical assistance for this project. And we and others from the toolkit are available to come out and work with you. We'd be happy to run a workshop or a series of workshops for you on these issues. Contact OVC TTAC. Here is the information. You can contact them online or by phone to sign your team up. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.